Why do some leaders inspire action while others only get polite nods? The difference lies in their ability to connect strategy to story. In this episode, we draw on academic research and expert interviews conducted for this project to show how storytelling is not just a performance skill, but a leadership capability that shapes organizational outcomes. We'll frame the discussion through a systems lens, the inputs of story listening and data gathering, the processes of crafting, performing, and measuring, and the outputs of trust, shared purpose, and successful change adoption. Along the way, you'll learn how to identify the right inputs before you tell a story, how to craft narratives that balance emotion and logic, and how to measure whether your stories are actually moving people. And it all begins with what most leaders overlook, the starting point that often decides whether a story resonates or falls flat. If you're new here, please subscribe and like, because I share tips to help you improve your career. The foundation of every strong leadership narrative comes from what happens before a single word is spoken. The three key inputs for effective leadership stories are story listening, cultural tension points, and leadership vulnerability. Without them, even the most polished communication risks missing the mark. The first input, story listening, goes beyond hearing surface-level opinions. It means systematically collecting the unfiltered perspectives that circulate inside an organization. Leaders can use confidential interviews, facilitated focus groups, and even observation of daily routines to uncover how employees actually describe their experiences. This approach, recognized in the research on leadership storytelling, ensures that stories reflect reality rather than managerial assumptions. The second input involves identifying cultural tension points. These are the unresolved conflicts or contradictions that shape how employees make sense of messages. If left unacknowledged, they become what researchers call anti-stories, counter-narratives that can undermine change efforts. A documented case in the literature showed that at AMCA, leaders used employee stories in workshops to highlight older workers' experiences. This reduced resistance and built a sense of recognition that made the change effort more acceptable. Incorporating tension rather than ignoring it strengthens credibility. The third input is leadership vulnerability, the willingness to admit imperfections and gaps between current reality and the desired future. Research emphasizes that credibility is built when leaders show authenticity by acknowledging limitations. When leaders skip this step, they risk losing trust. Background studies highlight how communication that feels imposed or disconnected from lived experience quickly leads to cynicism and erodes the narrative's impact. Employees don't only hear the words, they test whether the story aligns with what they observe day to day. To make these inputs practical, leaders can rely on three techniques: story listening through narrative capture, confidential interviews or focus groups for safe feedback, and shadowing or observation to identify unspoken behaviors. Together, these methods create a picture of how employees are already making sense of change, giving leaders the raw material for stories that feel grounded and relevant. These inputs are not optional. They determine whether a leadership story feels authentic or artificial. And as we'll see next, when authenticity is questioned, even the best crafted story can backfire. Authenticity versus manipulation sits at the center of every corporate narrative. Employees quickly evaluate whether a message lines up with what they have already seen in leadership behavior and past decisions. This rapid judgment doesn't depend on polished delivery, but on congruence, the fit between words and actions. Researchers describe this as the say-do gap, and it is one of the strongest signals employees use to decide if communication is credible. When rhetoric diverges from lived reality, the consequences are immediate. The literature on organizational storytelling shows that employees are adept at detecting when leaders use narratives to push a predetermined outcome without acknowledging contradictions. In these moments, anti-stories emerge, counter-narratives that reflect skepticism, or even cynicism within the workforce. This isn't theoretical. It is a documented risk that undermines trust during critical transitions. Manipulative communication creates disengagement because people compare leadership promises against what actually changes in systems, policies, or resource allocation. By contrast, authentic storytelling demonstrates alignment between strategic intention and everyday organizational practices. One historical illustration comes from the Walt Disney Company during the Great Depression. Disney's stories, built around characters like Mickey Mouse, created optimism and a sense of shared meaning in a time of hardship. Instead of masking the reality of difficult circumstances, these narratives gave employees and audiences alike a reason to believe in a hopeful future. The lesson here is that storytelling works best when it provides meaning that feels consistent with broader actions and values. Leaders who struggle with authenticity often try to fill gaps with heightened emotion, sweeping claims, or overly polished scripts. But research shows that these signals do not compensate for a lack of congruence. The more effective path is simple: measure narratives against observable action. A practical test is to ask whether decisions, resource allocations, and leader behaviors reflect the story being told. If the message emphasizes inclusion, are promotions and leadership appointments tracking toward that goal? If the story highlights sustainability, are investments flowing into systems that support it? Consistency across these areas is what keeps stories credible. To sustain this alignment, organizations benefit from transparent feedback loops, spaces where employees can question and challenge without penalty. This turns storytelling into dialogue rather than broadcast, strengthening narrative trust over time. Later, we'll show a straightforward checklist leaders can use to test the authenticity of their own communication. But before that, it helps to understand why some narratives take hold in organizational culture while others disappear almost instantly. The strength of a leadership story depends not only on its authenticity, but also on how it is built. The 4 elements of compelling leadership stories provide the framework. When stories are designed with these elements in mind, they create coherence, help employees see where they fit, and make complex strategies easier to grasp. Without them, even sincere communication risks fading without impact. Classical rhetoric, ethos, pathos, and logos still matters, but modern research adds more precision. Studies in organizational storytelling and narrative theory show that well-structured stories are far easier to remember and retell than abstract reports. The scholarship of Denning and Heringer outlines 4 elements that consistently differentiate compelling leadership stories: temporal framing, protagonist selection, tension and conflict, and concrete detail or plot. Anchoring stories in these elements provides both clarity and resonance. Temporal framing sets the arc of the story. Leaders situate present challenges within a larger timeline, linking past struggles, current obstacles, and a future direction. This helps employees understand change as a journey rather than a disruption. Protagonist selection then establishes perspective. Some stories center on leaders, others on teams, or even customers. Choosing the right main figure makes the story relatable and influences how employees connect with it emotionally. Conflict is the 3rd element. Without recognizing challenges or tension, stories feel flat and unconvincing. Conflict introduces stakes that demand resolution and allow the protagonist to demonstrate effort, resilience, or growth. Finally, plot and concrete detail make abstract strategy vivid. Instead of broad statements about efficiency or innovation, leaders who use specific actions, relatable setbacks, or customer moments create grounding images that stay with listeners. Research underscores that narratives structured in this way improve sense-making and retention. Employees can imagine themselves inside the story arc and understand their role in the organizational journey. Denning points to former IBM CEO Lou Gerstner's press conference as an example of effective style. His conversational tone and focus on concrete steps made abstract strategy accessible. This pairing of content with delivery shows how well-prepared stories can appear natural while being carefully designed. Still, structure is only part of what makes a story work. Even the best organized message falls short without the right emotional tone and logical balance. Leaders must understand how these forces interact if they want their stories not only to be understood, but to genuinely inspire action. If you're finding this helpful, please subscribe and like, because it helps us create content that matters to you. Also, if you want to take your skills further, check out our executive education and executive coaching programs at execbeat.com. Emotion and logic form the twin pillars of effective leadership narratives. Leaders who rely too heavily on one at the expense of the other risk losing either trust or momentum. Research on organizational sense-making highlights that, especially during periods of uncertainty, employees look first to emotional cues to decide whether a leader is trustworthy, and then to logical consistency to judge whether the path forward makes sense. Without this dual balance, stories struggle to mobilize people behind change. Weeks' work on sense-making shows how narratives become the framework employees use to interpret what's happening around them. Emotional resonance reassures and engages people on a human level, while logical structure provides the evidence and clarity needed to act with confidence. A story that appeals only to logic may feel cold and detached, while one that leans only on emotion risks being dismissed as empty inspiration. The most successful leaders design communication that deliberately intertwines the two. A practical tactic here is simple but powerful. Pair a brief, vulnerable leader-facing moment, such as sharing a personal reflection or short video, with immediate, concrete next steps. Employees receive both a genuine emotional connection and clear direction for what comes next. Maintaining this balance requires ongoing attention rather than a one-time effort. Story listening techniques, like structured focus groups or narrative capture, allow leaders to monitor when employees feel disconnected from the message. Pulse surveys can reveal whether communications are leaning too heavily toward facts without enough empathy, or drifting into inspiration without substance. Following up with behavioral indicators, like observing participation in change programs, engagement in team discussions, or willingness to adopt new routines, provides direct evidence of whether narratives are sustaining credibility. The risk of imbalance becomes most obvious when emotional appeals aren't matched by supporting actions. If stories of inclusivity or sustainability are not reinforced by corresponding decisions and resource allocations, employees quickly perceive the gap. This undermines both trust and motivation. Leaders who are deliberate about symmetry, aligning message, action, and follow-up create the most durable impact. Ultimately, emotion and logic work best together when treated as a system. Leaders connect, clarify, observe responses, and recalibrate. That feedback loop distinguishes storytelling that inspires in the moment from communication that drives real organizational change. To understand whether these efforts are truly working, however, requires moving beyond surface impressions and looking closely at measurable effects inside the organization. Measuring storytelling impact on organizational change requires moving from impressions to evidence. Leaders need a structured way to track how stories influence engagement, behavior, and ultimately organizational outcomes. The complication is that storytelling effects develop gradually, often across multiple layers of culture and performance, which makes subjective observation alone insufficient. Expert research and interviews emphasize that measurement is one of the weakest yet most critical areas for leaders to strengthen. A practical starting point is to distinguish between leading and lagging indicators. Leading indicators provide early signals of resonance and adoption, such as whether employees can recall the main points of a change narrative, or whether sentiment shifts in pulse surveys suggest greater openness to new directions. Lagging indicators emerge later and show up in outcomes like improved collaboration rates, participation in change programs, customer satisfaction, or talent retention. By tracking both types, leaders ensure they are not only assessing immediate reactions, but also long-term impact on performance. One useful frame, supported by storytelling research, is to measure across 3 dimensions: cognitive, affective, and behavioral. Cognitive measures capture message recall and comprehension. Did employees actually understand the story and its purpose? Affective measures assess emotional resonance and identification. Did the story connect with employees' sense of meaning or values? Behavioral measures capture action. Did employees change how they work, adopt new processes, or show higher engagement in the organization's initiatives? Seen together, this checklist provides a balanced way to diagnose whether storytelling is doing more than inspiring. It is changing what people think, feel, and do. Practical tools already exist to make this easier. Post-event pulse checks can reveal whether a leadership message landed as intended, while story listening follow-ups, such as moderated focus groups, highlight what employees heard, remembered, and questioned. Several expert interviewees stressed that employees often reshape a leader's story in their retelling, which makes these checks essential. Natural language analysis and ongoing surveys offer complementary ways of tracking narrative consistency across communication channels. But measurement also has to anticipate narrative decay, the way stories naturally lose strength without reinforcement. Scheduled refresh cycles extend impact and keep the story alive in organizational life. If you don't measure it, you can't iterate it. An iteration matters, because once a story moves into the hands of employees, it no longer belongs solely to leadership. It becomes something people actively interpret and reshape through their own sense-making. Sense-making theory explains why employees interpret leadership stories differently, even when hearing the same message. In situations of uncertainty, people don't simply absorb instructions. They retrofit new information into their existing mental models. This often determines whether change feels plausible or disconnected. Leaders who want to accelerate adoption must create stories that give employees concrete, localized examples so they can map the new future onto their daily work. Week's framework emphasizes that sense-making is about constructing a plausible picture, not delivering a single correct version of events. Research shows employees expand on small cues, interpreting them against prior experiences to create meaning. If those cues don't connect with recognizable patterns, narrative adoption stalls. The Anchor case highlights this principle. Leaders brought employee stories into workshops to surface how older workers were experiencing change. By acknowledging those perspectives and directly linking to immediate realities, leaders aligned the broader strategic vision with day-to-day work. Scholars like Sonnenschein also note that employees often filter change through multiple interpretive frames, meaning that without deliberate anchoring, the same story fragments into divergent meanings across groups. Cultural context intensifies these challenges. Storytelling that resonates in one setting may not translate elsewhere. Research underscores that leaders should localize narratives for different regions or professional communities while keeping a few universal anchor points consistent. This balance provides stability at the organizational level while allowing employees in diverse contexts to adapt the meaning to their own environment. For leaders, that means designing stories with non-negotiable components, such as the organization's core values or the ultimate purpose of the change, while leaving space for local managers to illustrate with stories relevant to their teams. Effective leaders treat sense-making as a continuous negotiation. Employees test leadership narratives against evolving evidence, adjusting their interpretations over time. This requires leaders to actively monitor how stories are being retold and what interpretations are gaining traction. Tools like targeted focus groups, narrative capture, and structured feedback sessions provide insight into whether messages are retaining coherence. Set up sense-check workshops. Ask teams to tell back the change in their own words and record the differences. That's the research-backed way to see how sense-making diverges. But capturing these interpretations is only part of the challenge. Leaders also need reliable systems to ensure that stories, once crafted, travel through the organization without losing their coherence. Internal communication infrastructure is the backbone of how leadership stories move through an organization. Strong systems are what allow a narrative to remain intact as it travels across functions, geographies, and reporting layers. When communication channels are fragmented or overloaded, stories lose coherence, and employees receive mixed or contradictory versions of the same message. Leaders who take infrastructure seriously recognize that the way stories move matters as much as the stories themselves. Organizational complexity creates predictable barriers. Messages passed through multiple managerial layers can easily distort, much like an informal game of telephone. Research points toward structured solutions. Standardized toolkits containing core narrative elements, visual anchors, and discussion prompts can help maintain message integrity. Rather than forcing managers to improvise, a toolkit preserves the central storyline while giving space for local adaptation. Leaders can strengthen this further by explicitly linking toolkits to frontline examples that show what the larger vision means in daily practice. Middle managers hold a particularly important role in this system. They are the primary interpreters who translate leadership messages into team-relevant language. Studies emphasize that equipping managers with training in narrative techniques ensures they amplify instead of unintentionally altering messages. When supervisors are developed as story stewards, they not only communicate more effectively, but also build credibility by bridging abstract strategy to local contexts. Digital platforms extend reach, but they cannot replace the interpretive value that managers add. Experts caution that relying solely on automated summaries or template-driven updates often strips stories of the local meaning employees need. The most effective approach blends scale from digital tools with nuance from trained human intermediaries. Feedback loops are the final structural element. Without feedback, leaders can't see how employees are receiving, retelling, or reshaping stories. Research highlights the use of quick pulse surveys, structured listening posts, or moderated workshops where teams restate the story in their own words. These mechanisms expose where narratives are drifting and allow for adjustment before misalignment calcifies. Feedback also signals openness and responsiveness, which reinforces trust in the story itself. Taken together, three principles shape strong communication infrastructure: preserve the core story, enable adaptation to local context, and build continuous feedback loops. Yet even the most robust infrastructure cannot compensate if leaders themselves lack the capability to craft and deliver compelling stories. That deeper layer of skill development is where organizations often face their next challenge. Developing storytelling competence in leaders begins with addressing a persistent misconception: the idea that great storytellers are born, not made. Research makes clear this is not the case. Storytelling is a skill that can be taught, practiced, and refined over time. Some leaders hesitate to invest in building this capability, viewing communication training as peripheral to their strategic roles. Yet, when approached as a structured discipline, narrative competence proves to be a central lever of influence and alignment. The most effective development programs follow a simple progression: assessment, training, and application. Assessment comes first. Tools such as 360-degree feedback, peer reviews, or narrative competence frameworks allow leaders to see where they stand in terms of clarity, resonance, structure, and adaptability. This baseline encourages targeted practice rather than vague improvement goals. By identifying specific gaps, Whether in structure, delivery, or emotional tone, leaders know exactly where to focus their development. Training builds on this foundation by providing techniques and frameworks for improvement. Dramaturgical methods, borrowed from theatre, adapt well to business settings. Exercises include video playback analysis, practicing vocal modulation, or exploring the effect of pacing and gesture. Researchers like Denning emphasize the importance of rehearsal. Stories told repeatedly with feedback become sharper, more persuasive, and easier to recall. Peer-based storytelling labs are particularly effective because they create a safe environment for trial, error, and refinement. Leaders can experiment with delivery styles, receive immediate feedback, and learn by observing others. Application is where skills are tested against live audiences. This means moving beyond workshops and putting stories to work in real meetings, team briefings, or stakeholder conversations. Field assignments, in which leaders must craft and deliver narratives tied to current organizational priorities, force translation from theory to practice. When combined with structured feedback loops, such as debriefs or after-action reviews, these assignments turn learning into habit. Over time, leaders gain not just competence, but confidence, seeing storytelling as part of their daily leadership toolkit rather than an occasional add-on. Framed as a continuous cycle, assess, train, apply, and repeat, this approach makes storytelling competence scalable across leadership teams. It also reinforces a culture where communication is considered a core capability rather than a soft accessory. And when leaders build this muscle collectively, the impact extends well beyond individual development. It lays the groundwork for storytelling to function as an integrated, strategic capability across the organization. Conclusion: leadership storytelling is not an accessory. It is a strategic capability that shapes how organizations align, adapt, and grow. The leaders who thrive are those who connect authentic stories with consistent action, creating clarity and trust in uncertain times. This week, take one practical step. Host a 20 to 30 minute listening session with a cross-section of staff, capture 3 recurring phrases, and ask how those align with your strategy. Next, pilot a small story action pair. Share a short personal story, link it to one concrete action, and measure whether employees recall and act on it. Before leaving, share in the comments one leadership story that influenced you, and subscribe for more research-backed tools to strengthen your practice. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like, because it helps us bring you more free videos. And if you're ready to grow your career, visit execbeat.com to learn about our executive education and coaching.